Let's turn this finished cross-stitch into a spooky pillow finish with a cute pom-pom trim. Unfinished finished object, be gone! Okay, so as usual, I'm about to demonstrate something that I'm in no way an expert at. But I did have someone ask me about this recently, and so I'm going to try my best and show you each step as we go. If you'd like me to tackle more complicated finishing techniques in a future video, please do let me know down in the comments, and I will frantically learn how to do that thing, and then come back here and pretend I know what I'm talking about. The pattern I'm using here is called Night Flight in the Garden, and it's by a designer called Winter Nightmare, who has a coffee shop full of spooky offerings. This one is just $3 minimum, and it's super cute. I stitched it up last year, and it's been sitting here in my unfinished objects basket, just waiting for its time to shine. Obviously this technique will work with any pattern, but if you do love the one that I'm using, I'll make sure there's a link to it in the description below. Right, so what are we gonna need? We'll need one finished stitch, one bit of backing fabric. Yours will likely be a bit more interesting than mine, but I can't afford to go out buying fancy themed fabrics just for the backs of things, okay? One decorative trim. Technically you don't need this to make a pillow finish, but you do if you want a pillow finish with trim. Obviously. This one's just basic black mini pom-poms. I chose it specifically because the pom-poms are attached to the strip securely and they don't wobble around independently like some others do. You can get this stuff from your local craft shop, from eBay, whatever. And of course, something to stuff the end result with. Another opportunity for this seemingly unending bag of fluff I bought like years ago from Hobbycraft. We will be sewing, and I'll be using my sewing machine for most of this, but to be honest, you could totally do this by hand as well. Either way though, we'll be doing a bit of hand sewing towards the end, so you'll need general hand sewing detritus. So you can see my stitched piece is square, and I'll be honest here, I stitched this on a perfectly sized piece of scrap Aida that I just happen to have, which is why it looks like I trimmed it down before the video. No, this is just the bit of fabric I had available at the time. Yours is probably a bit bigger, but the principle is going to be the same. Our first task is to make sure the design is properly centered. I'm aiming for somewhere around a ½ inch of plain fabric border around my stitching, and I tend to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so ½ inch plus 1/4 inch. I'm going to mark a line 3/4 of an inch away from my stitching on every side. I'm using an erasable pen here, but you're not going to see this line, so you can just use whatever you have got to hand and we'll keep you sewing in a straight line. We're going to attach the trim to this stitched piece first, and we're going to do it with the stitching facing up and the trim pointing inwards like this. Not outwards like this. No. I'm lining up the edge of my trim just exactly with that line we drew, and I'm starting at the bottom middle here just because that's where I'll be turning the piece and hand sewing it shut later. This'll make more sense soon, I promise. I do find it's handy to pin the first inch or so just to keep that end in place as you move it to the machine, but totally up to you. To the sewing machine! Absolutely nothing complicated going on here. The machine is just set to a simple straight stitch, so again you could totally stitch this by hand, it's just going to be a bit slower, that's all. Backtracking a little bit just to secure that first bit, and we are away. Now the corners are a little awkward. What we want to do is lay down the trim to make a nice curved corner, but as you can see, the presser foot kind of gets in the way. So what I do is lower my needle manually, then lift up the foot, and I can actually get in there and finagle the trim where I want it. Make sure you have a nice smooth curve and it's lining up with the guideline we drew as we approach the next side, and that is pretty much it. You want to take this just one stitch or two at a time, absolutely as slow as you can around the corner. It's a little awkward, but you'll get there. Slow and steady wins the race. Okay, so I'm going to attach the trim all the way around, so I'll meet you back here when that is done. Almost back to the starting point, and I'll just trim off this trim, for want of a better word. You can see I've left just a tiny amount of overlap there because it is better to be safe with overlap than sorry with a weird gap. Stitch that down, secure it, and stage 1 is complete. Now for the backing. Once again, we are going to attach these right sides together. So, backing fabric, face up, if your fabric actually has a face and isn't just cheap plain cotton like mine. Stitched piece, face down. My black thread is super duper visible on the white Aida, so I've got a nice defined line, and all I'm going to do is follow it round. This time we're going to start stitching about an inch away from the bottom centre, and we're going to follow that line as closely as possible but end another inch before getting back to the bottom centre. So effectively we're leaving a 2-inch gap at the bottom here, which is a nice size for getting the stuffing in without being so big it takes ages to sew closed. Also of note here, look at how wobbly that line is. I'm drawing your attention to this because I want you to know you do not have to have mad sewing skills to get an excellent result by the end of this project. If your thread is the same colour as your fabric or it's otherwise hard to see for whatever reason, I know some people prefer to quickly draw over the line in something more visible before moving on, so I'll leave that part up to you. You can pin or clip these pieces together if you need to. I'm going to add a few pins, and time for round 2. Alright, this is the point where you'll want to trim off any excess fabric, especially in the corners. I also tend to leave a little bit extra where we've left that gap, which you'll see why that is in a moment. Turn the whole thing inside out, not without some difficulty, and you pretty much have yourself a pillow. Now to stuff it, I find the trick with these sorts of things is to pay extra attention to the corners. If you leave an air gap there by accident, the stuffing tends to move around over time and it makes weird lumps, so just get it right up in there. Once the top corners are done, I'm filling in the middle, working down the sides, the middle, the bottom corners, and just right towards the end start stuffing in as much as you need to make it as firm as you want it to be. Now all we have to do is close up this gap at the bottom. And this is where I'm afraid your needle and thread comes in. Although, just as a note, I have seen other finishing methods that might suit you better. For example, you could attach your backing fabric all the way around instead of leaving the gap, then cut a hole in the middle somewhere to do your stuffing, etc. You would then cover the hole with a decorative patch of some sort. Or if you want to get real fancy, you could make the back into a cushion flap, or even make it button shut. But let's just keep it simple for now, eh? I've threaded my needle off screen because usual disclaimer about how long that takes to do with false nails on. And in this case I'm going with a loop start, which means I've just cut my thread twice as long as I would otherwise and folded it in half. I've threaded both ends through the needle, and that's that. You could also just thread your needle normally and tie a knot in the end, whatever you prefer. Alright, so you see this little extra flap of fabric that we left when we trimmed everything down. You can sort of fold that inside and pull everything tight to get an idea of what the finished piece is going to look like. And if you're using an easily creasable backing fabric like me, pressing this firmly gives you a nice guide crease to work with. I also do find it's easier if you push the stuffing down out of the way while you do the sewing. We're going to attach our thread on the inside of the backing flap, and I'm realising at this moment that black on black was not a great choice for a demo, so I'll turn up the lift a bit and hopefully you can see, because this is just a black void on my preview screen here. Oops. Anyway, I'm picking up a tiny bit of fabric with my needle and running through that loop to secure, then I'm just doing the same thing again, just to be sure. So now what you're going to do is put the needle through just a tiny bit of the trim on the opposite side of the gap, and then just alternate going through fabric and trim the whole way up. This is tricky at first, and even trickier when you have a camera in your face, and I am definitely not great at it at the best of times. But have patience, check regularly to make sure you're getting a neat enough finish, and if you need to pick a couple of stitches out and do them again, it is not the end of the world. Practice makes perfect, and all that. Once you come to the end of the gap, you can fasten off by picking up a bit of trim, pulling not quite all the way through, then popping the needle through that loop to make a knot. I usually do this 2 or 3 times in the same spot just to make sure. Trim your thread, and there we have it, a cute little Halloween cushion ornament just in time to join the rest of our decorations. Speaking of, I hope you are having an excellent spooky season so far, and hopefully my next video is going to be a little bit more explicitly Halloween themed. Until then though, thank you as always to all of my supporters over on Ko-fi, but especially to the Stitch Squad, who this week are Stitching Liz, Marianne Johnson, Sunny, Candy Riley Pettinger, Laura Sellards, Rosalie, Enlightened Flamingo, and our newest members who have been waiting I think over 2 weeks now for their first shout out, but they are also cheating by being 2 people under one name, so now we're even. Cross Stitch the Globe. You should check out their new Flosstube channel, I'll link it down in the description, it is great. Okay, I'll see you soon for some more crafty nonsense, so in the meantime, have a brilliant rest of your day and keep making cool stuff. Bye!